Chapter 14, Part 2 of How I Found Livingstone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How I Found Livingstone. Travels, Adventures, and Discoveries in Central Africa, including 4 months' residence with Dr. Livingstone. By Sir Henry M. Stanley. Chapter 14, Part 2. Our Journey from Ujiji to Unyanyembe. After Mizohazy is the bold Cape of Kabogo, not the terrible Kabogo around whose name mystery has been woven by the superstitious natives, not the Kabogo whose sullen thunder and awful roar were heard when crossing the Rugufu on our flight from the Waha, but a point in Ukaranga, on whose hard and uninviting rocks many a canoe has been wrecked. We passed close to its forbidding walls, thankful for the calm of the Tanganyika. Near Kabogo are some very fine mvule trees, well adapted for canoe building, and there are no loud-mouthed natives about to haggle for the privilege of cutting them. Along the water's edge, and about 3 feet above it, was observed very clearly on the smooth face of the rocky slopes of Kabogo the high water mark of the lake. This went to show that the Tanganyika, during the rainy season, rises about 3 feet above its dry season level, and that, during the latter season, evaporation reduces it to its normal level. The number of rivers which we passed on this journey enabled me to observe whether, as I was told, there was any current setting north. It was apparent to me that, while the south-west, south, or south-east winds blew, the brown flood of the rivers swept north. But it happened that, while passing, once or twice, the mouths of rivers, after a puff from the north-west and the north, that the muddied waters were seen southward of the mouths, from which I conclude that there is no current in the Tanganyika, except such as is caused by the fickle winds. Finding a snug nook of bay at a place called Segunda, we put in for lunch. An island at the mouth of the bay suggested to our minds that this was a beautiful spot for a mission station. The grandly sloping hills in the background, with an undulating shelf of land well wooded between them and the bay, added to the attractions of such a spot. The island, capable of containing quite a large village, and perfectly defensible, might, for prudence's sake, contain the mission and its congregation. The landlocked bay would protect their fishery and trade vessels, more than sustain 100 times the number of the population of the island. Wood for building their canoes and houses is close at hand, the neighbouring country would afford game in abundance, and the docile and civil people of Ukaranga but wait religious shepherds. From beautiful Segunda, after a brief halt, we set off, and after 3 hours arrived at the mouth of the river Uloesia. Hippopotami and crocodiles being numerous, we amused ourselves by shooting at them, having also a hope of attracting the attention of our shore party, the sound of whose guns we had not heard since leaving the Rugufu. On the 3rd of January we left Uloesia, and passing by Cape Herembe were in the Bay of Tongwe. This bay is about 25 miles broad, and stretches from Cape Herembe to Cape Tongwe. Finding themselves so near their destination, Urimba being but 6 miles from Herembe Point, the men of both boats bent themselves to their oars, and, with shouts, songs, and laughter, encouraged each other to do their utmost. The flags of the 2 great Anglo-Saxon nations rippled and played in the soft breeze, sometimes drawing near caressingly together, again bending away like 2 lovers coy to unite. The tight little boat of the doctor would keep ahead, and the crimson and crossed flag of England would wave before me, and it seemed to say that the beautiful laggard astern, "Come on, come on, England leads the way." But was it not England's place to be in the front here? She won the right to it by discovering the Tanganyika. America came but second. Urimba, though a large district of Kawendi, has a village of the same name peopled by refugees from Yamba, who found the delta of the Lejori, through the unhealthiest of spots, equal to that of the Ruzizi, far preferable to the neighbourhood of Sultan Pumburu, of southern Kawendi. A good chase by the victors seems to have given a shock to their systems, for they are very timid and distrustful of strangers, and would by no means permit us to enter their village, of which, to say the truth, I was very glad, after a glance at the reeking corruption on which they were encamped. In the immediate neighbourhood, nay, for a couple of miles on either side, I should suppose that to a white man it were death to sleep a single night. Leading the way south of the village, I found a fit camping place at the extreme southeast corner of Tongwe Bay, about a mile and a half due west of the lofty peak of Kivanga, or Kakunga. By an observation taken by the Doctor, we found ourselves to be in latitude 5 degrees 54 minutes south. None of the natives had heard of our shore party, and as the delta of the Logira and Mogambazi extended for about 15 miles, and withal was the most impassable of places, being perfectly flat, overgrown with the tallest of matete, echinome, and thorny bush, and flooded with water, it was useless to fatigue our men searching for the shore party in such an inhospitable country. No provisions were procurable, for the villages were in a state of semi-starvation, the inhabitants living from hand to mouth on what reluctant fortune threw into their nets. On the second day of our arrival at Urimba I struck off into the interior with my gun bearer, Kalulu, carrying the Doctor's splendid double barrel rifle, a Riley No. 12, on the search for venison. After walking about a mile I came to a herd of zebras. By creeping on all fours I managed to come within 100 yards of them, but I was in a bad spot. Low prickly shrubs, and tsetse flies alighting on the rifle sight, biting my nose, and dashing into my eyes, completely disconcerted me, and, to add to my discontent, my efforts to disengage myself from the thorns alarmed the zebras, which all stood facing the suspicious object in the bush. I fired at the breast of one, but, as might be expected, missed. The zebras galloped away to about 300 yards off, and I dashed into the open, and hastily cocking the left-hand trigger, aimed at a proud fellow trotting royally before his fellows, and by a good chance set a bullet through his heart. A fortunate shot also brought down a huge goose, which had a sharp horny spur on the forepart of each wing. This supply of meat materially contributed towards the provisioning of the party for the transit of the unknown land that lay between us and Mrera, in Rusawa Kawendi. It was not until the third day of our arrival at our camp at Urimba that our shore party arrived. They had perceived our immense flag hoisted on a 20-foot long bamboo above the tallest tree near our camp, as they surmounted the sharp, lofty ridge behind Nerembe, 15 miles off, and had at first taken it for a huge bird; but there were sharp eyes in the crowd, and, guided by it, they came to camp, greeted us as only lost and found men are greeted. I suffered from another attack of fever at this camp, brought on by the neighbourhood of the vile delta, the look of which sickened the very heart in me. On the 7th of January we struck camp, and turned our faces eastward, and, for me, home. Yet, regretfully, there had been enough happiness and pleasure, and of pleasantness of social companionship found on the shores of the lake for me. I had seen enough lovely scenes which, siren-like, invited one to quiet rest. Gentle scenes, where there was neither jar nor tumult, neither strife nor defeat, neither hope nor disappointment, but rest a drowsy, indolent, yet pleasant rest. And only a few drawbacks to these. There was fever, there were no books, no newspapers, no wife of my own race and blood, no theatres, no hotels, no restaurants, no East River oysters, no mince pies, neither buckwheat cakes, nor anything much that was good for a cultivated palate to love. So, in turning to say farewell to the then placid lake and the great blue mountains, that grew bluer as they receded on either hand, I had the courage to utter that awful word tearlessly, and without one sigh. Our road led up through the valley of the Logira, after leaving its delta, a valley growing ever narrower until it narrowed into a ravine, choked by the now roaring, bellowing river, whose resistless rush seemed to affect the very air we breathed. It was getting oppressive, this narrowing ravine, and opportunely the road breasted a knoll, when a terrace, then a hill, and lastly a mountain, where we halted to encamp. As we prepared to select a camping place, the Doctor silently pointed forward, and suddenly a dead silence reigned everywhere. The quinine which I had taken in the morning seemed to affect me in every crevice of my brain, but a bitter evil remained, and though I trembled under the heavy weight of the Riley rifle, I crept forward to where the Doctor was pointing. I found myself looking down a steep ravine, on the bank of which a fine buffalo cow was scrambling upward. She had just reached the summit, and was